Hello, friends. Welcome, welcome. I'm going to start by sharing about a really beautiful experience I had last weekend that I just was so unexpected. So, Julia and I have this habit of like going out. We're just going to go on a little walk and then we kind of off road. And what we think is going to be like a mile and a half long walk to look at the beautiful explosions of color up in the mountains becomes like a 4.5 mile adventure up the mountain, which is what happened last weekend. So we drove up. It was an incredibly foggy day to the point that we almost turned back because the visibility was so low. And right at the moment, driving up the mountain, right outside Santa Fe, that we almost turned back and then decided to keep going. The fog miraculously cleared, like we had driven, and we probably had driven through a cloud bank. So this mist parted, little patches of blue appeared, and by the time we got up to this really popular trail, and this was early in the morning, maybe 9:30, called Aspen Vista. The skies were like beautiful with just enough cloud cover that the sun wasn't battering down on us. And as we drove, excuse me, as we drove up, it's like Disneyland up there. People come from all over the country to see the aspens because the colors are so incredible. And there was one parking space available right at the trail. We hadn't been planning to go to this trail because it's always too crowded. We went, all right, somebody, Spirit Mountain, the trees, they want us to be here. So we pulled in and started walking up the trail. And it was just stunning. And as we walked, up a fire road and then up into the woods. We walked through about five or six, probably different ecosystems. And because the altitude kind of changes pretty quickly, the trees react differently to these small gradations in different oxygen supply and different temperatures. So as we walked, we went through these brilliant golden hues of aspen to darker, to then right up by the top where we stopped, all of the aspen had shed their leaves. And so the ground was just carpeted in these beautiful fallen golden leaves. And it just filled my entire being. Something Julia says and notices is when I get in nature like that, I just light up in a way that I don't in cities because everything around us is so alive and is so in tune with each other, right? The aspen less than 500 feet up from another grove shed their leaves because they were in tune with the weather and the wind. They knew what they needed to do in order to prepare for winter. And the ones lower down held on to their leaves because they knew that that was appropriate given the climate that they were in and their surroundings. And as we were walking back down the mountain, just another thing that I thought was just delightful about this is because we hadn't been planning to go on a long walk. We just had like coffee cups from our coffee shop. We weren't dressed for a hike, and we're like walking alongside and passing people who had like their packs and hiking sticks, and they were looking at us like we were crazy. So we're walking back down the mountain, finishing our coffee in our normal everyday clothes, and I was reflecting on all of the time that we spend in leadership retreats and trying to talk about ecosystemic growth and systemic change, that if you truly just walk in the woods for 45 minutes or an hour, and not just walk, but allow yourself to be penetrated by nature, to be changed by the trees and the soil and the rivers. That is a much more effective way of learning about systemic change and attunement and what it means to be truly willing, just like the trees are, to let go of things that are no longer serving in the current environment. There are incredibly complex and complicated frameworks and constructs that, as facilitators, if you're trained as a facilitator, you train to walk people through these very complicated processes. But if they're able to just walk in the woods or spend 2 days holding questions, walking in nature, and allowing nature to be their teacher, suddenly something else emerges, something new. And it really made me reflect 'cause I'm about to be going to a few different conferences that are happening, one in a really beautiful setting, one in a bunch of conference rooms. And a lot of the conversation at these places is going to be about social change, economic change, systemic change. And what are we doing? We're going into these square rooms and having, sometimes deep, sometimes emotional, beautiful, sometimes really annoying conversations about ecosystems. Where is the ecosystem's voice in these conversations? Where is the voice of the rivers? Where is the voice of the aspen? Where are those reminders? Right? All of the fancy language we use seems to be a way of separating us from it. And so we're never going to create change at the level of the core wound of our culture, which is that of separation. When we got back home after our unexpectedly long adventure, I came across this quote that was written in 1972 by a guy named Chief Dan George, who was a leader, indigenous leader in Vancouver, Canada. And this is from, again, 1972. And I'll just read parts of it because I think it's really relevant to some of these ideas. He writes, in the course of my lifetime, I have lived in two distinct cultures. I was born into a culture that lived in communal houses. My grandfather's house was 80 feet long. It was called a smokehouse, and it stood down by the beach along the inlet. All my grandfather's sons and their families lived in this dwelling. Their sleeping apartments were separated by blankets made of bulrush weeds, but one open fire in the middle served the cooking needs of all. He goes on to describe the culture that he grew up in as a place where people learned to live with one another and respect the rights of one another, where children shared the thoughts of the adult world, found themselves surrounded by aunts and uncles and cousins who loved them and did not threaten them. And beyond the human connections, there was also a deep respect for everything in nature that surrounded them. He shares that this is the culture he was born into. And now he's in, the dominant culture where he sees people living in smokehouses hundreds of times bigger than the one I knew. But the people in one apartment do not know the people in the next and care less about them. He finds it difficult to understand the deep hate that exists among people. Not that he judges it, it simply didn't exist in the culture that he grew up in. So something that he says at the end of this, as he explores the two cultures, is, I'm afraid my culture has little to offer yours, but my culture did prize friendship and companionship. It did not look on privacy as a thing to be clung to, for privacy builds walls and walls promote distrust. My culture lived in big family communities, and from infancy, people learned to live with others. My culture did not prize the hoarding of private possessions. In fact, to hoard was a shameful thing to do among my people. The Indian looked on all things in nature as belonging to him, and he expected to share them with others and take only what he needed. There's reflection or resonance in this with the conversation in the last episode about enoughness. But what strikes me, there's a few things resonating in this. One is, way back at the founding of the United States, the core kind of tenets or thinking of the Iroquois Confederacy were kind of appropriated as one of the backbones of the founding of the United States. But what happens when you take the ideas of a document, the ideas behind a certain form of government that spring out of a very specific culture, and you extract it or divide it from his culture, is that you don't have that same sense of kinship underneath it, right? It doesn't have the roots that it needs to truly thrive and to truly be authentic. And what I've started to see and have noticed in myself from time to time is the adoption of certain ideas that come from, you know, earth-based cultures, indigenous cultures throughout all of history, without really allowing them to penetrate us. We get excited by the ideas of them, right? Regenerative business. But often we don't really allow those ideas to penetrate in to change our minds, to change us at a somatic embodied level, so that when we walk on the earth, we're conscious of the weight of our steps. We're conscious of every step being a way of being in relationship with the world around us. That when we speak in a natural place, when we speak in the woods, that our voice, the vibration of our voice, actually has an impact on everything around us. And so, how do we calibrate that and then bring that into our leadership, bring that level of awareness and discernment and sensitivity and kinship into our workplaces, into our teams, into our change making? It's a radical proposition, I think. Radical, not in the like burn it all down sense, but in the going to the root. There's one more quote that popped into my head right as I pressed record, and this comes from a really wonderful book called The Secrets of the Talking Jaguar by Martin Prechtel. The subtitle of it is Memoirs from the Living Heart of a Mayan Village. And here is the quote. For there to be a world at all, every indigenous, original, natural thing must start singing its song, dancing its dance, moving and breathing, each according to its own nature, saying its name, manifesting simultaneously its secret spiritual signature. Shamans say the village heart can grow a brand new world house if it is well dressed in the layered clothing of each indigenous soul's magic sound, ancestral songs, and indigenous ingenuity. The wrecked landscape of our world house could sprout a renewed world, but a new language has to be found. We can't make the old world come alive again, but from its old seeds, the next layer could sprout. This new language would have to grow from the indigenous hearts we all have hidden. It shouldn't be a language of oneness, not one language, not a computer tongue of homogenization, but a diverse, beautiful, badly made thing whose flimsiness and inefficiency force people to sing together to keep it well spoken and sung into life over and over again, so that nobody forgets to remember. We need to find gorgeous, unsellable ritual words to reanimate, remeasure, rebuild, and replaster the ruined, depressed flatness left by the hollow failure of this mechanized, orphaned culture. We live in a kind of dark age, craftily lit with synthetic light so that no one can tell how dark it has really gotten. But our exiled spirits can tell. Deep in our bones resides an ancient singing couple who just won't stop making up their beautiful wild noise. The world won't end if we can find them. What I love about this is that it speaks to the idea that beneath the culture that we're in, each of us in our cells, remember what it is to be connected with the earth. Remember what it is to be deeply connected with the breath and live in this sense of reciprocal connection in a way that goes beyond not just indigenous culture, that all of us in our cells have an indigenous soul, a soul that is deeply rooted to Mother Earth. The other thing that resonated so strongly, especially in this moment, and this book was written in 1998, way back in the last century. So the other thing that resonates really strongly is this idea that this shouldn't be a language of oneness, not one language, not a computer tongue of homogenization. It seems to be directly speaking to the advent of AI, right? Which is at its base a homogenizing force. I don't know if y'all have clocked it yet, but a lot of the stuff that is being posted on LinkedIn, posted online, is starting to sound really similar already. Because my guess would be folks are really leaning on AI to help them. And by its nature, because it is a predictive engine, AI is going to homogenize. It's going to strip the specificity. It's going to strip the particular cadence and vibration of the individual heart and the individual soul. And I love the invitation that Martin Prechtel gives us to reclaim our own souls, to reclaim each of us on our own remembrance of what it is to be in relationship with the earth, to be like the trees in the forest, knowing when to let go, not because of our own personal intuition, but because the world, the system, consciousness, spirit is letting us know. And we're so attuned that it's frictionless. I'm part of this system. It's time for me to let go of this. It's time for me to go over here. It's time for me to have this experience. Trusting that as more and more of us attune to this system, each of us in our individual way, that the whole thing takes on a new shape and a new form. So what if systemic change was helping more and more people, more and more organizations, more and more leaders become so deeply attuned to the system that they want to change that instead of saying, this is our strategy for systemic change, they say, this is where the system wants to go because the system has told us. Which again is a lot of what the work in the library workshop is about. The system has told us, and now we are servants of that vision, right? We are taking our capacity to do in the world, and we're putting it in the service of a system that is alive, that is vibrant, that is struggling to find allies to bring it back into alignment or into a new alignment that has never existed before. And all of that came from an unexpected hike up in the woods. Thank you so much for listening. I guess the invitation for this one is spend a little time in nature if you can, and see what happens if you allow nature to sink into you, not just so that you're in a place enjoying beauty, but allow that beauty to penetrate into your heart and maybe awaken a part of your soul that's been taking a nap. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.